Everybody, welcome to our day on burnout. Françoise is the executive director of Tend, whose aim is to offer consulting and training to professionals on topics related to secondary trauma, empathic strain, burnout, self care, wellness, and organizational health. She's a registered psychotherapist and an expert on topics related to empathic strain and secondary trauma. Before becoming a specialist on stress and trauma, she worked as a mental health provider doing both crisis management and employee support to military personnel, medical students, residents, law enforcement, and other community mental health professionals in need of psychological support. Françoise has worked with the University of Southern California, the Los Angeles Police Department, Cirque du Soleil, the Chief Coroner's Office, and many other organizations that do high stress work. She is a Tedx speaker and one of the founding members of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Consortium. She is also the author of the Compassionate Fatigue Workbook, as well as several articles and publications. You can keep up to date with her work at www.francoisemathieu.com. So, Françoise, whenever you're ready, feel free to get started. I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm so pleased to get to do this morning. It's 8 o'clock in Canada where I'm talking to you from. So if I keep referring to morning. So my challenge is always that this is my life's passion. And when I have short periods of time to speak about things, it's just hard because I'm trying to think how in an hour or less do I convey how important I believe this is. And my second reminder, because you can tell, I'm sure from my name, is that I'm French Canadian. And because I'm French Canadian, I tend to talk too fast. Since the start of the pandemic, everything I do is recorded, and I finally was horrified. Recently, I listened to my own recording and I was speaking so quickly. So my reminder to myself today is just do what I can with the short amount of time I have. And this is not the only chance we have to have a dialogue. So that's my own message to myself. So let's dive right in. I wanted to tell you a little bit about where I live and how I became interested in this topic. So before I moved to Kingston, Ontario, I'm originally from Quebec, but I actually lived in the UK, and I was a volunteer at, I lived in Cambridge, and I was a volunteer at Addenbrooke's Hospital in the casualty department. And I also worked at the center that was called the Visual Development Unit. And this was a center where we did research with children who had had significant birth complications. So I was not in the field at the time, I was very young. But both of those experiences really hitched a ride with me in a way that I didn't even understand at the time. I was not familiar with concepts of secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma. I didn't know anything about those. It wasn't until I went to graduate school where I learned about these concepts. But what I know is that my work at the Visual Development Unit and my work as a volunteer at Addenbrooke's really altered my sense of the world. And one of the things they did is both of those experiences created significant dread or anxiety for me when I ended up having my own children. I was working mostly in the pediatric intensive care at the hospital. And I remember several years later when I had my first child, I was convinced that something terrible was going to happen because that's all I had seen, right? I didn't see healthy deliveries or healthy babies when I worked there. So it's just a sign that as a civilian, you too can develop secondary traumatic stress based on the experiences that you have. But let's fast forward now several years later. In fact, many years later, I moved to Kingston, Ontario. It's a community of about 130,000, and it is the prison capital of Canada. It's also a beautiful place, so don't let that put you off from coming to visit us. But it has a large military base, and we have between 7 and 10 correctional facilities. And this is the Kingston Penitentiary, the oldest prison in Canada, in North America, in fact, maximum security prison that only closed a few years ago. And I started volunteering at the Kingston Penitentiary. And very early on, I started noticing that some of the prison guards were incredibly toxic, burnt out, cynical, disengaged. They definitely exhibited what you and I would probably call compassion fatigue and probably some burnout as well. But what intrigued me is that not every prison guard was like that. Not all of them were disenfranchised and cynical. And the same became true when I worked and connected with our hospital emergency ward as a mental health crisis worker Some of the nurses were burnt out and cynical, and some of them were not. And this became my area of passion. This field that I'm referring to is called career sustaining behaviors. I became really interested to find out what allows us to stay in these really challenging fields with very complex, broken systems, lack of resources. You know the story. How come some people are well and how come some are not? So that really is my lens. And the final thing I'll say about my lens is that I have a social justice lens. It's a story for another day, but I grew up in the high Arctic. My parents were teachers with First Nations communities. And I started to see that our erosion of empathy and our burnout can truly have a significant impact, particularly on the most disenfranchised members of our community. Imagine a burnt out judge. Imagine a burnt out police officer, victim service worker, and so on. So that's what I'm fascinated by. The final thing I'll say is what the research shows is that the burnout does not correlate with years of service. And what that means is that when we look, for example, at data on physicians, nurses, teachers, child welfare workers, their rates of burnout are actually higher at the beginning of their career. So it's not after 15 years of service that we're seeing people leave the field. It's after 3 to 7 years of service. And that is also something I'm really, really fascinated by. So I work in a very high trauma field. I'm not going to list this. I've been doing this work for 25 years, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the type of folks that I support. So a lot of the work I do is what is called ICAC, and ICAC is Internet Crimes Against Children. I'm sure you know what that's about. I work in anti-human trafficking, and I also work with public health and many other different workforces. But one of the things that I learned is if I was going to support people who do extremely high trauma exposed work, we needed to find ways to self-regulate, but also co-regulate. Now, the pandemic has brought some interesting clients to us that were not our typical folks. They weren't law enforcement, healthcare, education. They were really ordinary citizens who worked for financial centers, call centers, all sorts of other much more customer-facing workplaces. And that was a surprise to us because I really am someone who does mostly support for high trauma exposed workers. And what they said is we are really seeing that, going through incredibly unsettled times, a lot of the citizens that contact, let's say, customer service are extremely dysregulated. And I'm sure you can easily imagine that. Maybe you've experienced it yourself. And for example, this large financial institution we worked with in the US, their call center operators were receiving a very large volume of abusive calls, people who were truly, as we say, had really flipped their lid. They were out of their prefrontal cortex. They were no longer able to show empathy and be, connected, and sometimes were quite frankly abusive. So it turns out that what I want to talk to you about today goes way beyond healthcare and law enforcement and so on. I think all of us could truly benefit from this knowledge. I also think, and if you've ever listened to my Tedx talk, you've seen me talk about this, that many of us are natural caregivers in our personal lives. I'm sure many of you who are listening to this have been through a situation where you were trying to support a friend or a loved one through a prolonged, entrenched crisis, a relationship breakup, some mental health concerns, or other things. And I'm sure at some point you experienced a real shift in your ability to be present for them. So really that's been my second quest, is to find out what is the sweet spot between not caring at all and over functioning to the point where we rescue other people. So let's fast forward to 2015. By 2015, I've been in the field of burnout, compassion fatigue for 15 years already. And I start getting requests from workplaces, and they're basically saying to me, hey, why are people not coming to our mindfulness lunch and learn? Or we gave everyone a stress ball. Why is everyone still so frustrated? And the 2000s, the aughts, if you were actively working in the field in those years, there was a huge movement towards workplace wellness. I'm sure many of you remember it. There was a lot of language around self-care, work-life balance. But my criticism is that it became kind of the shiny new toy. In Canada, we call it spray and pray. You spray well-being at your workplace, but you don't change any of their working conditions or improve any of the resources available to them. And then you're surprised that your staff are not actually feeling happy and joyfully, engaged in work. And so I wrote this article called Beyond Kale and Pedicures. It's available anywhere. You can just Google it. I ended up self-publishing it. I was publishing it for a magazine. I worked on this article for over a year, and the editor and I seriously butted heads. And finally, I was like, you know what? I'm going to publish this myself because this is what I want to say. And what you'll see in this article is I start interviewing different workplaces, particularly some hospital environments, and try to find out what is truly working to bring back compassion in the workplace. So the conclusion is, of course, I'm sure it's of no surprise to you, is that although I absolutely sure have nothing against yoga, I love yoga, helps regulate my anxiety, and I believe that self-care is truly important, they weren't quite the magic bullets we had hoped for. And the pandemic has amplified that in a way that I can't even begin to explain, where finally many workplaces started realizing that what we need is actually daily activities. It's not about what you do on your time off. It's about how I'm able to do this work in a way where I feel confident, competent. I have good supervision. My immediate supervisor is healthy, which we started seeing a lot in the pandemic, extremely exhausted leaders, of course, but also where I actually have a place to talk about my moral distress when the resources are not available to help the people that I want to help, and how do I deal with that? So what Niall and I wanted to do today is really explore what does work. So I'm not going to spend the whole time saying these are the problems. I want to talk to you about key strategies that are way beyond telling everyone to get enough sleep and exercise, although I highly recommend those two things, and I certainly do them. The first thing that I think we all need to do is to explore our own personal experiences, the reasons for which we are called to be helping others, whether that's as a volunteer in your personal life or as a profession. And I think as someone who's actually lived in the UK, I've lived in the UK, I've lived in Sweden, I lived in New York City for some time, and now I'm back in Canada. I think that those are all dominant cultures where there's still a tremendous amount of stigma around mental health, mental illness, and around vulnerability. And I see that particularly in some of the fields that I work with. So whether that's, physicians, the legal profession, law enforcement's doing a little bit better in Canada, but there's still a lot of stigma around acknowledging that many of us actually are attracted to this field for personal reasons. I don't know why. Why would there be a stigma around that? It's not odd that if you are attracted to the field, for example, of child welfare or mental health, it may be because you yourself experienced something related to that or someone in your family did. But I also want to invite all of us to think about the messages that we received about work-life balance and self-care when we were growing up. So I'll give you a quick example of that. I'm sure folks who are listening are from many different generations, but I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm in my 50s, very early 50s, just to be clear. And I was raised by parents who were born in 1941. So one of the things to think about, in full disclosure, this is a picture of my brother. He's older than me, and as a second child, there are no cute pictures of me sitting on a snowmobile. So here you go. There's my brother, Ben. And as I mentioned earlier, we grew up in the very high Arctic, where there was a lot of multi-generational trauma due to the genocide that was perpetrated on First Nation communities in Canada. And my parents, who were themselves French Canadian, grew up and were born in 1941. So they were part of the silent generation. And the message that my parents conveyed to us was, you work until you die, and then you work some more. And there is no such thing as a holiday. Basically we are up in these regions to serve a community that invited us here. We are guests. We are lucky. We have privilege, and we have a duty to serve. And although that sounds incredibly noble, and it is, no disrespect to my parents, it also conveyed to us, my brother and I, really complicated messages where basically, unless you are working all the time, unless you have a checklist to kind of demonstrate what you've achieved, you are basically kind of failing. I talk about this. You can go to our website, which is just tandacademy.com or .ca. And I talk about this in an article called Disappoint Someone Today. And I unpack a little bit what the legacy is of, having been raised by parents who themselves had their own trauma and who were really trying to convey powerful messages that were healthy, but how tricky that can become. And I know that my brother and I often talk about that unless we have achieved something for the day, that we really struggle with just doing nothing. And that, can become really problematic. So the first thing to invite you to think about is, what are the messages you received? Do you yourself have adverse childhood experiences of your own? And those of you who are not familiar with the adverse childhood experiences study, I'll provide some resources for you. But we know that many of us have some type of heritage that we need to be aware of and recognize when it's interfering or contributing. So as Niall mentioned, we created a think tank in 2015 called the Secondary Traumatic Stress Consortium. And what we really wanted to do is untangle the incredibly messy terminology debate that's out there. There's so many words, I'm sure many of you have heard. Is it burnout, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, empathic strain, and many others? And it's for another day, it's a longer conversation, but I really was concerned that we were all kind of using different terms to explain something that really was, in my opinion, much more of an overlapping Venn diagram. Now, if you're not a researcher in the field, it doesn't matter, call it whatever you want. It doesn't really matter at all, in fact. But if you are a researcher in the field, as you can well imagine, it becomes problematic if we're all using different terms and different scales and different testing measures, because we can't actually we can't do good quality research in data. So our think tank continues to work through this, and our conclusion, and you'll see in the handout, I provide a comprehensive definition of every one of these circles in this Venn diagram, but I want to highlight a couple today. The conclusion is that the real picture, and therefore the solution, is far more complex than calling it burnout. So this is basically what we came up with. And the way to think about these circles, it depends on the profession you're in, is to look at what are your contributing factors, your risk factors, and your resiliency factors. So what's going on in your life? Personal circumstances, what's going on right now? Are you well? Are you going through a separation, financial crisis, addiction issues, mental health issues, what have you? Work-related traumatic grief and loss, we often talk about big L, little l. We know big L. Big L losses are a traumatic event. Somebody dies, you lose a beloved colleague, person that you serve. But we also need to acknowledge small losses. The pandemic has brought a lot of losses, people leaving, resigning, retiring, all sorts of different ways in which we lose our community of support and of practice. Direct exposure is what a lot of first responders experience every single day, of course. But we also need to think about, some of us actually do work in dangerous environments where we are threatened, perhaps even assaulted. 99% of all nurses have been bitten, spat at, scratched, pinched, hit, what have you. But a lot of them, if you say to a nurse, have you ever experienced direct trauma? They'll say, no, of course not. But they have. We just haven't kind of defined it well enough for them. Indirect trauma is where all the secondary vicarious trauma lives. So those are stories that you might hear through people who confide in you. If you work in this field, that could be obviously through bearing witness to a story, going to court, looking at crime scene or forensic evidence. But it also, of course, happens extensively through media for all of us. Empathic strain, I'll go back to that in a minute, is the new term for compassion fatigue. I'm going to explain in a minute why the term is changing, call it whatever you want, but it is really related to that profound emotional exhaustion that we develop either through a certain individual whose situation never improves and we just have nothing left for them, or because we see so many similar cases and at some point they just become one and the same. The failures of the system is one of the trickiest one, because you and I can't necessarily single-handedly fix the problems of the system in which we work or live. And that's the one that can lead to significant moral distress. We're seeing very high rates of moral distress during the pandemic. Many examples exist. It originally comes from the field of healthcare, where we profoundly disagree with what is being done, or we disagree with the constraints, that we have. So I'm not allowed to do X, Y, and Z for various reasons. And that really has an impact on my feelings of moral and ethical duty. Working conditions is where burnout belongs. Burnout can happen in any occupation. You could develop burnout working in a factory. You could develop burnout working at Cirque du Soleil. You could develop burnout working in healthcare. It has to do with your hours, your pay, your rewards, your recognitions. Who do you report to? Your workplace climate, all of that. So burnout belongs here, but I'll explain in a minute why I think we need to stop only calling it burnout, because if we just focus on work-related conditions, one of the things we miss is the impact of secondary trauma and also the impact of moral distress. And many burnout measures in physicians, for example, don't actually talk about secondary trauma at all. And I respectfully think that's a mistake. The final circle is a social cultural context. We added this circle in 2016. A lot of my colleagues are American, and it's been very relevant to, have a dialogue about what is it like for you, particularly if you are a member of a marginalized, discriminated group, underrepresented group. This is not just your job or your life experience, it's your day-to-day experience as well. So this is actually when I do full day workshops with folks, I go through every one of these circles and get each person to identify your roots of risk, but also your roots of resilience. In which parts of these circles are you doing particularly well right now, and which circles need attention? So yes, I do think that using the term burnout as an umbrella term is a mistake. It's not a mistake for citizens. I mean, I use it all the time when, if I was in a cocktail party and I was telling people what I do, I'm definitely going to use that term. If I'm going to cross the border into the United States, it's the term I'm going to use with the border agent, which as an aside leads to lots of great conversations. They often try to get a little free therapy from me, which is quite dear. But I think that we shouldn't, if we're actually doing research on this topic, we should not just call it burnout, because it's so much more than that. Burnout's a big piece of it. I also am going to throw out the two terms from my title. Compassion fatigue actually doesn't really exist. And let me explain to you why it's a term that needs to be replaced. I use it extensively. It's the title of my book. But really what started happening when this term was coined around 1995, there were some very good reasons for it. I'm going to provide you with a link to a panel conversation I had with some of the creators of the term. But from the very start, the Buddhist community very kindly and gently said to us, you cannot fatigue compassion. You can't call this compassion fatigue. That's not a thing. Now, we were so busy doing our own thing. We're like, yeah, it's fine. It's fine. And they were like, no, you cannot fatigue compassion. So finally, we were ready to listen. And they said the following. They said, compassion is an endlessly renewable resource. It's like love. I don't know who you have in your life, but I have 2 children. And it's not like when my son, my second child, was born, I was like, but I gave all my love to the first one, And it's not like every time I see my kids, I think, but I gave you love yesterday. I'm exhausted from loving you. And the Buddhists argue that compassion is the same. It is an endlessly renewable resource. And it's also a verb. So let me explain that real quick. So as I said, if you're interested, we hosted a panel conversation very recently to try and suggest that we all need to stop using the term. It does roll off the tongue though, so it's very hard for me to unlearn 20 years of terminology, but what really the research is showing is we should actually be calling it empathic strain. And this actually leads us to a tool. So I want to explain it for a quick minute. So as we know, and this is some of the excellent work on empathy by Tanya Singer and others, empathy is about feeling with, right? So I feel your pain. There are suggestions that we may even have mirror neuron activity so that if you are experiencing something very painful and I'm present for you, if I feel it too, maybe you've had that where we say, I feel your pain. So I remember a few years ago, someone was sitting next to me and she told me she felt very nauseous and I felt nauseous for her. That's empathy. And there's a suggestion that that activates our pain receptors, which I'll talk about in a minute. Compassion is not actually feeling with, it's feeling for, but it's also a verb in the sense that it's a feeling of concern. I'm concerned for you and I do want to help you. And the reason why that's important is that you can actually, when you notice that you're feeling empathy, you can actually shift into compassion. And I want to explain that real quick. So huge caveat, folks, before I show you or start talking about the pictures of the brain, my husband's actually a neuroscientist, and he often says, he doesn't love when civilians like me start talking about neuroscience, because he has a very famous quote, which is basically, we don't know anything about the brain. I'm being polite right now. That's not what he said, but you know what I'm saying. He said, listen, there's so many inferences that we make about this is the such and such center of the brain. I always invite folks to take all of that with a very, very big grain of salt. There are some things we know about the brain. We know where the speech centers are, for example. We know about the prefrontal cortex and how it modulates, impulse control and helps with reasoning. But I always want to, invoke a real caution whenever someone like me is about to say, this is the center of the brain for this, just take that with a huge grain of salt. Be that as it may, some of the fMRI, so that's a brain imaging activity measures that were taken, there was a whole bunch of studies of Buddhist monks. And Buddhist monks, as you know, are called expert meditators. They may have up to 20,000 hours of meditation. And what they did is they actually exposed them and then a control group to traumatic images and sounds. And they did sounds because some of you may find that too. I'm much more disturbed and triggered by audio footage of trauma than actual pictures. And if they're accompanied, if they come together, I will normally turn off the sound because I don't actually need to hear the sound. And I find the images less dysregulating. So what they found with these Buddhist monks and the control group is that the control group had a lot of activity in their pain network, unless they were sociopaths, in which case they saw activity in their pleasure center, but that's for another day. The Buddhist monks did not actually show activity in their pain network. But that alone is not that interesting, because you'd say, well, the Buddhist monks went to their happy place, they meditated and were able to create a distance between the pain and suffering they were witnessing and what was going on for them. But in fact, what was found is that they had a huge increase in activation in their compassion network. And what the Buddhist tradition believes in and recommends is engaging in what is called loving kindness meditation. And I'll explain that in a quick second. So what we found is that if you are experiencing empathy and you're feeling someone's pain, what they recommend is you can switch into this other mode where you're going to be actually experiencing compassion for them instead. And that is actually far less damaging for you, but it also allows you to be more helpful to them. Because now, instead of focusing on self-regulating yourself and coping, you are actually able to be in that action mode of how can I be present for you? So there was a study done at Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, by Barbara Fredrickson and her colleagues. And what they found, which is really interesting, is that you can actually learn compassion. And what they found, they did this compassion training that I'll mention in a minute. And if you do this for several weeks in a row, it can actually increase your sense of well-being, but also your sense of compassion. So I'm going to give you an example. I try this stuff out on myself every quarter. I don't do New Year's resolutions. I don't believe in those, but every quarter I try something new. And so in September, I decided to try this activity. I'm a very evidence-based person. You can probably tell so far. I don't tend to be very kind of crunchy West Coast woo-woo. Like I'm very pretty concrete about things. And so I tend to want to know the research behind an activity before I do it. And I had heard about loving kindness meditation for years. If you haven't tried it before, Greater Good in Action is a free website. I believe it's by the University of Berkeley. And they walk you through a very simple 15-minute loving kindness meditation. And for years I heard about it, and simply put, it's basically sending well wishes to another person. May you be well. May you be safe. And I was like, I don't know, okay. But then I started to try it in September. And I'm saying September because in Canada, in September, we started having a lot of protesters. They were picketing our hospitals. They were preventing our healthcare workers from going to work. And I was experiencing an incredible amount of anger towards the protesters. I was not feeling compassion for them at all. I was also working with the COVID units. So I was right in there. I was talking to people who worked in critical care, exhausted nurses and others. And I really felt struggle, towards experiencing compassion towards the protesters. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to try loving kindness meditation for September, for the fall. And I cannot explain to you how, doing it for 2-3 weeks in a row, It has also become part of my embedded system. I'm not perfect at it, not feeling a lot of loving kindness towards certain, world leaders at this moment. So it's not perfect, but what it does is you are then switching from your pain network to your compassion network. So why does this work? This is a huge maybe. We don't know. Again, remember what I said, we don't really know that much about the brain, but some of the theories is that we think of maybe it might be stimulating the insula, which is a tiny little part of the brain that I'm showing you here, which might be increasing self-awareness. We're not sure yet, but that's one of the theories. So I'm a huge book reader. You can probably see in the back here, that's just a few of my books. I'm a huge consumer of books, particularly in my field, and always looking for best practice recommendations. How do I help and support people who've experienced trauma? How do I self-regulate myself? And one of the first books I want to recommend to you today, particularly if you work in the helping professions, is by my friend Brian Miller. I should disclose that I wrote the foreword to this book, so I'm completely biased, but I have no financial affiliation to this book. And Brian worked in children's mental health for decades. And he became really interested in this notion that we do not need to avoid pain and suffering of others. And what he says in his book, it's a beautiful lyrical book. He uses incredible storytelling and metaphors. I cannot recommend this book enough. But in it, he says, we do not need to wear a hazmat suit to protect ourselves from trauma. And he became concerned. A lot of us in my field, we would see people who would say, oh, I just don't feel anything. That's how I protect myself from the pain and suffering of others. And he said, that is not what we want. If you were in distress, I don't think you want someone who is your helper, your police officer, your nurse, what have you, who has completely left the building and is just there in body. He said, I think we need to have our hearts broken over and over again, and we need to find ways to remain present every single day. So this is not about the holiday you take. It's not about the self-care rituals that you use after work. This is what you do right in the soup. And I cannot recommend this book enough. Absolutely beautiful. My favorite tool, I was thinking this morning, how do I convey in 45 minutes my top 10 tools? And this is it. So my favorite tool is recognizing when I'm out of my window of tolerance, which I'll explain in a minute, but also that also helps have compassion for others, because there are times where you are still within your window of tolerance, but other people are not. And let me explain that briefly now. So I don't know if you've ever had this happen where you've spilt milk all inside your refrigerator, all the way down into the vegetable crisper. Or if you're not a big milk drinker, I'm sure at some point you've been stuck in an incredible traffic jam, correct? In both instances, there are three possible reactions for you. The first one is that you are what we call in the optimal arousal zone. Like stuff happens and you're like, oh, well, you're well rested. And it's like, that sucks. I'll just turn on some tunes or listen to my podcast as I'm stuck in traffic, or I'll just clean the fridge. No big deal. Other times, based on a variety of different things that are going on for us, we may have a very short wick and we rip the door off the fridge. I'm being dramatic, but I'm sure you know what I mean. Or you experience road rage. And that's called hyperarousal. We call that flipping your lid. In my work with the military, I spent 10 years working as a civilian for the military. Soldiers coming back from, trauma centers. So, Afghanistan, Rwanda, Somalia. A lot of them would go into hyperarousal, particularly some of them who had PTSD, but they would quickly flip their lid to rage. Their window of tolerance, their actual wick was extremely narrow. But what I don't think we talk about often enough, and where we often show a loss of empathy, are towards people who are numb. And we call that hypoarousal. Hypoarousal is, I don't rip the door off the fridge. I lay in the puddle of milk and I just surrender, right? And a lot of people that are experiencing significant multi-generational trauma, poverty, adversity, lots of barriers, they often go into shutdown mode. And they often get blamed or forgotten by workers. So you might have someone who was supposed to fill out certain forms to get benefits, let's say. Or they were supposed to show up for this really important appointment and they don't come, or they don't fill out the paperwork. And the caseworker is like, why did you not do this? Are you lazy? What's wrong with you? And what we don't talk about often enough is that there's a wonderful book that was written by Devin Price called Laziness Does Not Exist. the possibility is that they've actually gone into total shutdown mode. So just for the purpose of today, what I really invite you to consider is to be self-aware of how wide is your window. Notice when it's not. And this is where self-care belongs, folks, right? This is where what we can do every single day to widen our own window of tolerance are the basics. I don't know what's true for you, but I know that if I exercise, I have a wider window of tolerance. If I don't doom scroll all the time, if I get enough sleep, if I don't drink myself to sleep, if I don't consume 5 cups of coffee in the morning, I have a wider window, and then I can deal with whatever is being sent my way. So this original work comes from Dan Siegel and subsequently from Pat Ogden and others. We simply can't ignore the basics of human physiology. I knew this was true, but it became so true during the pandemic. I was working with so many leaders who were respectfully treating the pandemic as if it was a 2-week, catastrophe, not a 2-year global debacle. And they were pushing their staff to work in a way that was clearly unsustainable, particularly staff who were perhaps homeschooling, dealing with lockdown, COVID restrictions, you know the story. And we know that we can't ignore the basics of human physiology. There was a study done in Israel, which, as an aside, they don't wear wigs, so I'm not sure why they decided to show this photo. Thank you, Guardian. There was a study done in Israel that found that judges were far more lenient after lunch than before lunch. You were way more likely to be granted parole after they'd had a sandwich. You cannot ignore the basics of human physiology in terms of decision-making, self-regulation, and just human error. My friend, Dr. Deb Thompson, who's a psychologist in Ottawa, sent this to me at the start of the pandemic, and I thought it was perfect. Those of you who are of my generation, you'll probably remember poor Nancy Reagan's anti-drug campaign in the United States. And she had this awesome picture called "This is Your Brain on Drugs." And it was a frying pan with an egg in it. Not sure it was very effective as a deterrent, but this is what Deb was riffing on here. And this is a way to also develop empathy or compassion for others. And basically, if your brain, let's pretend this is your brain, or it's your client's brain, or it's your colleague's brain, if 3/4 of your brain is monopolized by pre-existing problems, worry, fear, confusion. I'll give you a concrete example. Before the pandemic, my brother worked for Cirque du Soleil. He worked there for 18 years, and around March 17th, 2020, 98% of people who work for Cirque du Soleil were laid off and subsequently let go. So he ends up, after 18 years of working there, unemployed, ineligible for unemployment insurance because he worked in the US and it was a jurisdictional issue. And thank goodness he lives in Canada. He ended up on what was called CERB here, which was basically anyone who had lost their job got $2,000 a month in lieu of employment insurance. I'm sure you would understand that my brother, 3/4 of his brain was monopolized with just basic survival. How do I keep a roof over my house? Whereas my concern was I had 5 times more work than I could possibly deal with. So I wasn't worried about my day-to-day survival. So his brain and my brain would have looked very different. The coping pie, we can all cast our mind back to 2020. There's a lot that we've learned because we're resourceful and we're resilient. But I remember I was in Asia actually when the pandemic hit, and I was in Vietnam where everyone was stockpiling toilet paper. Like they're driving their mopeds with toilet paper everywhere. And I thought, is this a gastrointestinal illness? Like, what is going on? And of course, that was, just mass panic buying. And I think some of that has improved. And what it means basically is what is left for energy, motivation, and focus is just a little green pot. And so leaders who said to me, people are less productive when they work from home. I was like, respectfully, compared to what? They're less productive during a pandemic than before a pandemic? Yes, of course they are, sir. So I'm going to finish by sharing with you what are our other favorite tools. We call them micro practices. And if you go to our website, you'll see they're all free and they're downloadable. So I just want to highlight a couple. But what we know from neuroscience, and this is some of the beautiful work on neuroplasticity by Deutsch and others, is that the more you do something like my loving kindness practice in September, the more you do it, the more you create the pathway to fall back into that place right away. And we call that train your brain to be here. Depending on where you live, I'm sure growing up, you had a game called Snakes and Ladders or Chutes and Ladders. And you know what it's like, simple game. And if you think about, you get to that chute or that snake and you fall all the way back down to the beginning, if you train your brain, you become able to drop back into that place very, very quickly. So there are many things we can do. We call them arriving and end of day practices. How do I start my day? If I'm working from home, I've been in this room for 2 years now. When I'm done working with you, I will take this shirt off and put something else. That's just telling my brain that I'm switching gears. So ways to arrive and ways to finish. My favorite one is 3-minute breathing space. I used it last night because sometimes I have insomnia. I tend to have, I have an anxiety disorder. So I tend to go to anxiety and not things I can control, the future and the past mostly. And this is very simple. It's just 3 minutes. And again, you can find it on our website. And I find actually now that I've done it for months, I just do the first minute, which is just noticing sounds around me. And I immediately fall back to asleep. So the more you do them, the more they help. The final thing I want to mention is the importance of pausing. And I told you what I did in September. That was my quarter kind of strategy. My strategy in January was to get off Twitter. No offense, if Twitter is working for you, it's totally fine. I found Twitter very helpful in the fall because it helped me hunt for vaccines, but it really became dysregulating for me once I'd found vaccines for my community and everyone was fine. I found that it would really create anxiety, particularly, the responses. And you know what I'm talking about if you've been on social media. And what it reminded me of is what Viktor Frankl, very famous thinker and Holocaust survivor, said years ago, which is that between stimulus and response, there's a space. And what we don't see, of course, on social media is people taking time to take that breath, right? They are not taking a pause. There's no way. And so it reminded me to pause. And I still am well informed, but I don't need to be informed every single minute. The final thing I'll mention, and then I'll mention a few books and turn it over back to the Q&A, is Stephen Covey's Circles from 7 Habits, 1992 book, which helps me every single day. Every single day, I remind myself what is within my control, what is in my sphere of influence, and what is it that I have absolutely no control over. And that can be true for me in a global situation. It can help me in my community. It can also help me in my workplace. So to finish, remember the cynical kind of burnt out, prison guards, they had daily decisions to make about their conduct. And they could just be disenfranchised and angry about everything at work, or they could leave, or they could decide to stay, but also have a positive influence within what they could control. So I'm just going to quickly mention some key books that I found incredibly helpful. Compassionomics is a book that was published 2 years ago. And it was basically doing a study that showed that when you show compassion in healthcare, huge amounts of improvements take place, but also that patients need less pain meds if you show them compassion for 40 seconds before they actually go under, if you're, for example, the OR nurse or the anesthesiologist. Trauma Stewardship, in my opinion, is the absolute best book for any of you who do trauma-exposed work. It was written by my friend Laura Van Den Lipsky. She has an incredible TED Talk of the same name. You can find it easily. It was a TED Talk that was recorded in a women's prison. And I'm just going to leave it at that. It's incredible. This is the book, the #1 book. If you're not familiar with adverse childhood experiences and you want to learn more about the genetic and immunological impact, but what also can be done, I recommend Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's book. She also has a TED Talk. It's the best TED Talk on adverse childhood experiences that I can think of. And I'm going to finish with 2 more books. The Body Keeps the Score. If you're not familiar with childhood trauma, this is the book that explains, the shift in our awareness and understanding of complex trauma. And Widen the Window is a book that was written by a military, a soldier, and she provides lots of tools about how to widen our window of tolerance. So I want to finish by sharing a quote with you, and then we'll turn it over. So my friend Laura, who wrote Trauma Stewardship, has a beautiful short little book, perfect for the pandemic, called The Age of Overwhelm. And it's all concrete strategies to help ourselves. And she says, and I believe, if we quiet the mind, we can tend to the world.
Thanks so much, Françoise. That was a fantastic presentation and a great way to end there as well.
My question was, I'm doing some research at the moment. I've just started on compassion fatigue and burnout in the coaching profession. So I was wondering what your whether you had any thoughts on that. I imagine that just hearing your talk, I imagine that the first thing would be don't call it compassion fatigue.
Yes.
Which made me giggle earlier because it was after I'd actually written it down. But yeah, so just any thoughts that you might have around that. I've only just started. I've done a first couple of interviews. It's a grounded theory study because there's nothing else out there about it.
Yes. So it's really interesting. I'm glad you're mentioning that. There are huge gaps in the research. We did a study recently, where a meta-analysis, and we found that the only really truly studied group are 46-year-old white female social workers. If you're a 46-year-old white female social worker, we know a lot about you. That's basically, survey data that gets sent to the College of Social Workers, and those are the respondents. So there are huge gaps in the research, which I think is exciting because it means that anyone who wants to do a master's or PhD has lots of good data. Number one, I'm going to ask Niall after he can share my email with you if you want to contact me. There's a lot of really interesting research. I'd be happy to share with you kind of where the field is at. What are the gaps in the research? I will very quickly mention there is a tool I really like, and you may have come across it already. It's called the ProQol, P-R-O-Q-U-O-L, or P-R-O-Q-O-L, the Professional Quality of Life Self-Test. It is still the gold standard. Those of you who are not familiar with it, it studies 3 measures. Number 1, burnout for real, the real burnout, the one I believe in, working conditions. Number 2, it measures compassion satisfaction, which is the rewards of the work. Number 3, it measures secondary trauma, how much trauma you're exposed to. It's a 30-item questionnaire, and I still absolutely believe in that. But anyone who's doing research, you're welcome to contact me. I'm happy to give you lots of good data on that.
Thank you. I'll definitely take you up on that. Thanks.
Yes, please. Thank you.
I asked me if self-hypnosis and meditation is it different for us, or what do you mean?
Different for us than what?
To protect burnout.
Are you asking whether it's helpful for protective? Sorry, I just need to clarify the question.
The difference between self-hypnosis and meditation.
I don't actually know a lot about self-hypnosis. I know people have found it really effective, but that's outside of my area of expertise. So I couldn't comment pros and cons because I don't know enough about it. I know that I have colleagues who have found it really helpful, but I haven't had a chance to look at the brain science and see whether it's activating the same spot. So I can't comment in a well-informed way.
Okay.
And Angela, you had a second part to your question, just about.
Yes, the second, ja genau, neurodiverse person, the tolerance window is more shortly.
I can speak to this personally because my daughter and my husband both have severe attention deficit disorder, and they're very open about it. And I'm so glad you brought this up. We talk daily about their window of tolerance. And as many people who are listening know, a lot of people who are neurodivergent have decreased frustration tolerance, for example. So if I'm in a car with my husband and we're stuck in a traffic jam, he is not listening to songs and being zen. He immediately flips his lid. So we have daily conversations about that. I'll add a piece. One thing we found in our household is they often experience a window of tolerance that's narrow when they are like when their blood sugar is low. So at dinner time is a time where we have more family battles, fights, arguments, because they are also tired and not fed, and they create conflict to get stimulation. So yes, I love using the window of tolerance to have a good conversation with folks who are neurodiverse. It's a great question. Thank you for asking. 100%.
Yes.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon.
Good morning, or afternoon. Yeah, well, people from all over the world, so you never know what to say nowadays. Yeah, I was just wondering, in a way, referring to what you started at the beginning, this idea that, for me, I'm a psychotherapist and training to be a counseling psychologist, and I've personal thing. I'm 16 years in the 12-step program, so I've got lots of experience of my own and others, trauma and so on. And I think if I had to, many things are very useful, I find, for mental health and well-being and so on, which of course impacts the physical too. But I think if someone said to me, what do you think is probably the best thing you can do, I would say meditation, not mindfulness, because I think that's a poor version of the Eastern, all that Eastern wisdom of up to 5,000 years. So I would say meditation with that philosophy, which you started with, you know, the Buddhists and the compassion. I'd say, I think, and it takes a lot of effort and time, you know, you have to do it regularly and to, you know, for it to go anywhere. But I think I would say, I think that's probably the number one intervention, you know, if you've got time to do it. I'd be interested on your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I would say two caveats to that. I agree with you. I'm glad the previous person was asking about neurodivergent. I know that a lot of folks who have post-traumatic stress disorder or some form of neurodiversity do not really find that the classic method of meditation works for them. So I prefer to recommend modified versions. So for example, and you know this, right? Walking meditation may be more helpful for some folks. I think what puts people off is that when, and you know, we know even John Kabat-Zinn said the least interesting thing is sitting on a cushion for 40 minutes. Like you never need to do that, right? I think it put people off that some people, a lot of the soldiers I worked with were never, ever going to do that for a million reasons, but they loved hot yoga. So hot yoga, trauma sensitive hot yoga, eyes open, nobody touches them. That worked for them. So I think that we need to let people know of so many different ways that they can do that. I would add to your toolkit, because I agree with you, the second thing that changed my career and saved my career was becoming trauma informed. Because by becoming trauma informed and understanding adverse childhood experiences, it allowed me to remain present for people who behaved in a way that seemed aberrant to me. It allowed me to have a bigger framework, but also when I got trauma training, and you know, I did my graduate degree in 2 different universities. They were excellent schools. We didn't learn nearly enough about trauma treatment. When I became confident and competent, I was less emotionally distressed because now I felt like I actually had a tool to help them. So that would I'd throw that into my toolkit as well.
Yeah. No, I that's great. I mean, I agree with it. It's interesting you just say that. Yeah, so this a way of meditation doesn't work for everybody. You know, I mean, walks in nature can be great. That's a lovely way for people who don't want to sit on a cushion or.
Exactly.
And actually, I don't sit. I lie.
Yeah.
I can't
Exactly.
sit. But anything or running. I mean, running is interesting. That's great. Thank you very much. Very
Thank you.
cool.
Thank you so much. Or riding your bike across very vast parts of the world, Niall.
Yeah.
So I'm so sorry. I always have an extra slide because I have always this fear of running out of content, which is ridiculous because I always run out of time. So the balance map, you'll see it in your handout. And what it is basically, I spent quite a lot of time about a decade ago trying to think about what are the 9 key elements that I need in order to do this work and stay well. It's not a beautiful graphic. It should actually probably be a pyramid. Like, you know, I just threw 9 rectangles together. You can do whatever you want, but they have not changed in a decade. They are always the ones I need. And if you look at it, basically, I started by thinking, what is the number one thing I need in order to be well, right? And you and I, before we started, I talked about sleep and exercise being really important. But then I continued to create this kind of toolkit for me to self-regulate. And the thing I found, I'm going to highlight only 2 of them in the map for today. How do you restore yourself? So I'm an introvert, although I'm clearly not shy, but I'm an introvert. I refuel through solitude. The pandemic has been so hard for me because I have a household full of people. I lost access to the moments where I recalibrate myself. For other people, it's the opposite. The final one I'll mention is understanding how I react to change. I had a lot of uncertainty when I was young. Some pretty difficult things happened when I was 9, which really shattered my sense of safety of the world. I don't like surprises, even if they're fun. So if I were to work with you, I'd say, Niall, you know, don't ever send me a memo Friday night at 5 o'clock saying, can we meet Monday morning? Because you will completely throw me for the weekend. If you were my boss, I'm like, I'm obviously getting fired, right? But if you and I had chatted and I said, hey, listen, I tend to go to that place. That's my history. Here are some different ways we can do it. Then it can be really protective. So that's a short version of the balance map.
100%. Well, Françoise, that's all we've got time for today, but I just want to say thank you so much for a brilliant presentation. I think people have got loads from that.
There's so much good material out there right now, but if you wanted just a short version, I would say when you wash your hands, which we have to do all the time, when we wash our hands, instead of thinking about the future or the past, just feel the hot water on your hands and the soap right? Get off social media when it gets to be too much, and think about the loving kindness piece of being able to be present in ourselves, but have generosity towards others is where I would begin with this whole thing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Françoise.